Bantam Audio Publishing. Bowdrie's Law. Stories by Louis L'Amour, a Bantam book. A Note on Tracking and Following Sign by Louis L'Amour.
The art of reading a sign is a very important one. I used to do a lot of tracking myself, and I was pretty good at it. The first thing you have to look for is anything that's out of place, anything that doesn't belong. For example, in the case of a tall field of grass, a man walking across that field will knock the grass down the direction in which he's going. A horse crossing that field will knock the grass down the direction he came from because he swings his hoofs. You learn to watch for the scars of a steel shoe or an iron shoe on a rock. You learn to see a rock knocked out of its socket. It's dry country, and a rock will be set in a socket in a trail. And if it's knocked out of place, you can see this, you notice this. You notice broken branches, broken twigs. A good reader of sign will be able to follow a trail at a pretty fast pace, usually. Some people who teach that sort of thing now suggest you carry a stick to measure the stride of a person or of a horse. That's not necessary, really, because if you have any eye for distance at all, once you get a pattern, you see what a man's stride is, you know where to look for the next footprint, or approximately. And so you don't need the stick at all, you just measure with your eye. Reading a sign is a very skilled art. I think perhaps the greatest practitioners outside the Apaches are the Bushmen in Australia. They do some truly remarkable things. But some of the Western men have become just as good as the Apaches were. I've learned my first reading of sign a little bit from my uncle, and then I learned more from an old man who'd been raised by the Apaches and had lived with them. He rode on war parties with Geronimo and Nana. And I got a lot of the information from him that I used in Hondo and that I used in The Lonely Men, some other stories. For example, in the beginning of Shalico, I have him kicking some horse manure apart to see what the horse had been feeding on. And that way you could tell the horse came from wild country or from country where you get feed from a barn or stable or field. And there's all kinds of things to know, and the more you do it, the better you become at it. I wouldn't want to put myself up as a reader of sign now because I haven't been doing it enough. Now that I have a ranch in Colorado, I'm going to be doing it more. I'll get back in the feel of things again. One of the things you learn when following sign is to track a person's mind, not only his footprints. You try to decide where he's going to go, or what he's headed for. What does this man want that you're following? What does he need? Now, if he's traveling across the country, he's going to need water. And water holes were few and far between. That was a big help. If you could get a direction, you could decide about where he was headed for. By and large, the rangers tried very hard to bring them back alive in some cases. In some cases, they weren't very particular about it. And if a man had a pretty bad reputation, why, he was up for grabs, you might say. And they would bring them back alive if they could. But in many cases, they didn't try very hard. One thing about the West is extremely important, is that the country itself is an actor in all the stories. A man has to react to the land he's in, whether it's a prairie country or a desert country or a country like the Big Bend of the Rio Grande down in Texas, where it's something like the Arizona desert, only still different, with high cliffs and many rocks and cactus and desert. The land is always important. You've got to know the land. So I try to get old diaries and journals of people who lived there at the time and who described the country. And I try to find out how it was in their time. For instance, oftentimes there were springs that have now dried up, that were very good springs in their time when there was more water available. The country has changed to some degree. So I try to write a story so that if a man came back from the time of the story, he would recognize the places and the people. He would say, yes, I know this man, and this is true. And I've had many old-timers write to me and say, this is the way it actually was. People who remember it. People are raised in different environments. And Chick Bowdrie was raised on the outskirts of San Antonio near a town called Castroville. There was another little town nearby called Tejanos. And Castroville and Tejanos were both settled by a bunch of people brought over here by the Count de Castro, who was of Portuguese background, but he brought his group over from Switzerland, Germany, and France. And this large colony settled in there near San Antonio. So consequently, a lot of the children, and that's where Chick Bowdrie grew up, played with children who spoke French and German and picked up a smattering of both languages. Children acquire languages very easily, and so it was simple for him. Well, he had a horse. The hammer-headed roan that I speak about was a miserable horse. It was a very, very good horse, strong and tough. He could go for hours and hours and hours, like many of the Mustang-bred horses could. But he was mean. He was mean with Bowdrie. He was mean with everybody else. But Bowdrie knew how to handle him. He avoided his teeth and he avoided his heels, and he got along with him fine. And the horse would just ride forever. Sometimes a cowboy working for a ranch had his own special horse, which he kept. But he also had a number of horses that he could ride, because in the normal day's work, a cowboy would usually wear out 2 or 3 horses. And certainly on a roundup he would, or on a cattle drive. So you had to have a number of horses available for him. Many of the things in my stories come from real incidents. I don't always use them in their real context, but I always use them the way they were used. For example, this is a story, actually, it really happened in a case of an Arizona ranger. This ranger was trying to arrest a Mexican outlaw named Chacon. And Chacon was not quite normal mentally. He was a little bit insane, and he was a dangerous, very, very dangerous man. And he had killed a number of people, and this ranger wanted to arrest him. And so he went to a former law officer who had become an outlaw, Bert Alvord. And he told him, "Can you smuggle me into this camp? Let me pose as an outlaw, and I'll go in the camp." And Alvord says, "There's no way in the world you can get this man. He'll kill you, because he'll be very suspicious." Well, he wanted to try it. So Alvord smuggled him into the camp and introduced him as an outlaw, and Chacon, I don't think, bought it at all. So he was very, very watchful. Well, somehow or other, this ranger had to get a gun on this Chacon. And he knew if he made a move toward his gun, he'd get killed. So he started telling a story, and he had a cigarette in his mouth, and he picked up a twig from the fire to light the cigarette. And he stood there talking. He let the twig burn down to his fingers. So it was a natural reaction, jerked his hand away, drew the gun, and got him covered and captured him. So I used that in my story. Well, many times they tried to get men to become rangers who didn't listen to them and wound up being outlaws. But a man who was an outlaw, or almost on the verge of being an outlaw, would often understand the mind of the outlaw very well. There's the old story about set a thief to catch a thief. And they would set a man who knew the country to follow these people. And Chick Bowdrie did this. He'd worked on cow ranches around. He was a very tough young man. And Bowdrie was a man who could be shot at and still shoot accurately. He was a very cool customer, you might say, and very much in control of himself and his nerves. And so he was a good man for the job. I had known a somewhat similar man, and that gave me a general idea. He wasn't a gunfighter or anything like that, but his appearance was somewhat like Bowdrie's. And I had decided that this was the kind of a man I wanted, who was very much a loner, a dark, kind of inscrutable man, a man who didn't have many friends, was virtually unknown around the country, just came drifting through, and he was a man, a very independent mind, and I gradually worked him out through the stories.
And now, Strange Pursuit. Strange Pursuit, an audio adaptation from the short story by Louis L'Amour. The town of Jasper was a sleepy town. Its citizens usually rested easy in the belief that their hard-earned savings were safe at the local bank, the only one for miles around. They felt certain to a man that whatever trouble might arise, their good sheriff could handle it, and that come sunup, all would be put to rights, if not in the world, at least in the small part of it which they called home.
Ride, you men! Ride!
That was before the time that Charlie Venk rode into town. Together with 3 other men, he helped himself to everything that he could find inside the 4 walls of the Savings and Trust Association and disappeared into the night just as quickly and just as mysteriously as he had arrived. Venk's trail was easy enough to follow. In the headlines of small-town papers across 3 states, one could read of the misdeeds of an outlaw whose description closely matched
Sample complete. Ready to continue?